Attention, attention all personnel. Welcome to a special episode of FW Presents, the Omnibus Show for the Fire and Water Podcast Network. I'm your commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Rob Kelly, and joining me to discuss the TV series MASH on the occasion of its 45th anniversary is General Zaki Hassan. Zaki, welcome back to the Fire and Water Podcast Network.
Hey, I'm just glad I'm not a major.
That's right. I figured you're coming to visit, and the visitors were always generals on that show, so I figured
that's true.
It was appropriate. Before we get into our personal histories with MASH, as I mentioned, it's the show's 45th anniversary. It debuted on CBS television on September 17th, 1972, which, if you're listening to this show, the day it comes out, that's today. I just want to do a brief overview of the show for any of you that don't exactly know the history of it. Basically, of course, it was originally a book by Richard Hooker or Richard Hornberger, depending. And then it was made into a movie by Robert Altman, which was a massive success. And then CBS and 20th Century Fox got the bright idea, maybe we could make this into a television show, even though it's all about sex and foul language and blood and all these things. They somehow thought it would make a good TV show. They hired producer Gene Reynolds and writer Larry Gelbart to craft the show. Larry Gelbart made some decisions early on, which was, first of all, to bring Frank Burns back into the fold. In the movie, of course, he shuffled off into a mental hospital. But Larry Gelbart decided, no, he's going to be the main villain of our piece. He got rid of one of the three leads, which means Duke Forrest was not going to be president in this TV show. And they went about and hired this sort of interesting cast of actors, Alan Alda playing Hawkeye, Wayne Rogers as Trapper John, McLean Stevenson as Colonel Henry Blake, Loretta Swit as Major Houlihan, Larry Linville as Frank Burns, Gary Berghoff as Rita O'Reilly, the only regular to be retained from the movie. The show debuted, like I said, on September 17th, 1972, to a resounding indifference. The first season, nobody really cared about it. It got middling reviews, lukewarm ratings. And apparently the only person at CBS that cared about this show, that thought it was good, was the wife of William Paley, who was the president of CBS. And apparently every week she would begrudge her husband that this was a great show and he should keep it on the air. And apparently that's what really helped the show stay on, was the pillow talk from Mrs. Paley. So eventually over the summer, the show's ratings started spiking up because people caught it in reruns. So then CBS decided for the second season, they would put it on Saturday nights after All in the Family, which was their blockbuster show. So Larry Gelbart essentially wrote a second pilot, which kicked off the second season, and the show was a massive hit. The audience that had watched All in the Family, stayed for MASH, realized the show was good, and off it went. And the show was basically a giant hit for the remaining 10 seasons, to the point where, despite numerous cast changes and changes behind the scenes, it remained popular. And in fact, during its last couple of seasons, it was the number one show on television. And when it went off the air on February 28th, 1983, the final episode, which was 2.5 hours long, was the highest rated broadcast fictional show in the history of television, with a 77 share. For those of you who don't know what that exactly means, it means of all the people watching television that night, 77% of them were watching MASH. That is a number that will never be equaled in this fractious, way of we watch television now. That number will never be equaled. 125 million people watched the final episode. Over time, it made its way into syndication, and it became a bedrock of syndication packages all over the world. That's how I discovered it. And the show is still running to this day. So that's the, brief history of MASH. Now, Zaki, I'm going to take your bags into the VIP tent. So while I do that, why don't you explain, what's your history of the show? Why do you love it so much?
Oh, man. Well, I have to admit up front, I am a relative piker when it comes to MASH fandom, when it comes as contrasted with you. So I'm basking in your reflected glory, Rob. I did not grow up with it. I grew up with MASH as the thing that would come on before The Simpsons in syndication. So I would usually watch, the last 4 minutes of it, before The Simpsons started. So I didn't watch it at all during my childhood.
What a combo.
It's actually a great combo because I think tonally there I see embers of MASH's comedy style, especially early MASH, in what they did on The Simpsons, and I only see that now in hindsight, especially just by happenstance. Right now, before we started recording, I was watching the episode "The Bus" from the fourth season, and I'm watching MASH with my kids right now, and right afterwards they're like, "Can we watch The Simpsons?" And I put on The Simpsons, and I was like, "Man, this is like a flashback to when I was a kid." It's very funny. But I was always aware of MASH. I knew the characters. It's interesting when I think about it. Like, I knew who the characters were, and I think I attribute that partially to just the way the show had really penetrated pop culture to the extent that even people who hadn't seen it knew it or knew of it. I also attribute that to having read like Mad Magazine parodies and stuff. I remember specifically, I remember there was a Mad parody of MASH's later years, and it was making fun of how the show had outlasted the Korean War by 4 times or however long, however much
years.
long.
Yeah, the Korean War lasted 3 years. MASH lasted 11.
There you go. Right. And I remember the Mad parody making fun of that, and it was like, here's a thing for Trapper John. Where's he? Oh, he went back to this. And where's Henry Blake? Oh, he went back home and got killed by doing Hello Larry or whatever. It was. I mean, I don't know if you remember reading Mad Magazine. The great thing about Mad,
yeah.
it was like you didn't understand the references, but you would still laugh, right?
Yeah, it's true.
So again, it was always kind of part of the ether for me. And you know this story already. I invested in the series when they put out a complete series box set on DVD, including the film, and it was called the Martinis and Medicine Collection. And I was like, well, I've never watched MASH before, might as well start now. And so I bought it, and I watched the movie, and I watched the show. And this was 10 years ago. It was right when my first son had been born, and so I would rock with him, on the rocking chair and get him to sleep, and I would just watch MASH. So I blazed through the whole series in about, I would say 5-6 months,
Wow.
and I loved the show, and so by that time, I mean, MASH was not part of sort of the pop culture conversation the same way it used to be. But I'm glad I watched it then, and it's weird because, I mean, just in those 10 years, so many of the cast members have passed away. Like, we're seeing a rapidity now, unfortunately, of people leaving us who were part of the MASH series.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, these are all these guys now are in their 70s and 80s at this point.
I know.
So, yeah, I've told people before that I don't have too many people that I consider heroic, but in terms of fictional characters, but like Hawkeye is one of the ones. I just keyed into that. But no. So what about the show appealed to you? I mean, when you watched it, because I mean, it's got all these ancient references to stuff. You talked about the Mad Magazine. I mean, MASH is full of old timey 40s and 50s references that when I was a kid, I was like, what are they talking about? Like, I don't know who that is. So what was it that appealed to you so long after the show had sort of shuffled off the mortal coil?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately good storytelling is about compelling characters, and we don't need to have an essential grounding in the sort of internecine specifics of the Korean War to understand war, right? And I think that's the brilliance of the show, and that's what this goes back to Altman with the film, where it could have been about Vietnam to the point that the studio was like, no, make sure people know it's about Korea. I mean, war is war, right? And the beauty of the show is that it could be about Korea, it could be about Vietnam, it could be about Desert Storm, it could be about Operation Iraqi Freedom, right? The essentials are the same, which is these doctors who are in a situation where they're just trying to preserve their own sanity while doing this just godforsaken, I was going to say godforsaken work, but they're doing God's work in this godforsaken situation. And I mean, that's universal, because unfortunately, war is a truism of the human condition,
Yes. Yeah, when I watched it in syndication. It aired an hour every night from 7 to 8, and that was when I discovered it. And one of the things that I love about immersing myself in pop culture, I really enjoy. If there's something I like if there's a lot of it.
Yeah,
I sort of enjoy the deep dive. Like when I watch it in syndication, there was no internet, so I didn't know how many episodes there were. So I just kept watching it, and I kept seeing more episodes. I was like, wow, this thing is,
wow,
I mean, I'm just not I'm not someone who, if they like a musician, and they did 3 albums, to me, I would get tired of the 3 albums very quickly.
sure,
I mean, there's a reason why I have a Bob Dylan podcast, because there's 40 records to talk about. There's lots of stuff. And so with
lots of
MASH,
content.
yeah, lots of content. So with MASH, there is 251 episodes, and it breaks down into very distinct eras. The first 3 years, it's the core group that I just mentioned of Hawkeye, Trapper, Henry, Frank Burns, Hot Lips, Radar, and then you have Klinger and Father Mulcahy sort of coming in as side characters and eventually sort of getting promoted. And then both Trapper and Henry left at the end of the 3rd season in different ways. And then they were replaced by B.J. Honeycutt and Colonel Potter. And that iteration of the show lasted for 2 seasons. Then Frank Burns left. He was replaced by Major Winchester. He stayed on until the end of the show. And then in season 8, the last cast member to leave was Radar O'Reilly. And so for the last 3 seasons, the show was a fairly consistent group of actors. You had Alda and Loretta Swit stay through all 11 years. I will say the thing that really hooked me, and I agree with everything you just said about the constancy of war. War is war. It doesn't matter the settings. And yeah, I didn't need to know the history of the Korean War, though I started learning it because of MASH. I was sort of interested in it. But one of the things that I think the movie MASH gets across that doesn't interest me as much is that I feel like the movie has the idea of these people are being put in an impossible situation where their lives are in danger, they're facing blood and death on a daily basis, and therefore they kind of turn into kind of cruel people. And
Yes.
the movie is okay with that. The movie is saying this is what happens. They're good at their jobs. They're good doctors, but they've in some ways kind of curdled into really mean people. And the show, to me, takes the opposite tack. The show says, in a setting where it would be excusable to give in to your worst, your basest desires, these are people that are fighting to retain their humanity.
It's more important than ever to stay human.
Yeah. And that appealed to me. I was a sensitive kid. I was not a macho kid. Hard to believe somebody that read comic books was not a macho kid. And I appreciated the fact that Alan Alda, who became a really creative powerhouse over the course of the show, he wrote a bunch of episodes, directed a bunch of episodes, and of course he starred.
He was a one-man band for some of these things. My gosh.
Yeah, he's the only cast member to appear in every single episode. There was an episode of season 5 where he is the only cast member.
That's right.
So he's 251 for 251, and I appreciated his willingness to be sensitive, his ability to say it doesn't mean you're not manly, but you can be sensitive to people's feelings. You can be thoughtful, and that appealed to me as a young child, and I've always stuck with that. So of the iterations of the show, is there a particular era that you find you just tend to want to rewatch more than others?
I think that's actually a really good question. I was thinking about this train of thought, in prep for this, and I was like, every era of the show is different, but it's rarely a situation where I'm like, I only like the Trapper John era, or because I like B.J. Honeycutt and Trapper, so I don't. It's, to me, when I look at the show, I'm like, man, it sucks that we lost Trapper, but I'm glad we got B.J. Like it's a tough choice,
Mm-hmm.
I think the first 3 years are the strongest in terms of representing more of the sensibility of the film. But I don't think MASH ever became Zombie MASH. You know, because we see that with a lot of shows that sort of outstay their welcome, where they do become kind of a parody of themselves. I think that MASH, for its 11 seasons, as you alluded to, I mean, it went through these very subtle tonal shifts, but it was always compelling, and it did become more of a dramedy by the end of the show. But by then, we were so invested in the characters that we didn't mind.
Mm.
So I would say probably the Frank Burns era is if I have to pick, like if we're as a dividing line, I do find those episodes more fun. I like Winchester. I didn't find him as compelling a foil as
Right,
Frank Burns
right.
was.
Yeah, I mean, part of the difference between, like, say, Trapper and BJ is that Trapper and Hawkeye are much more of a duo.
Yes.
They're hard drinking, they're womanizing, they are much more alike. And
Yes.
it's when he is replaced at the end of the third. Now he disappears. Wayne Rogers left due to some sort of contractual kind of thing. He felt that Alan Alda was slowly taking over the show, which ended up really being true. I don't think in a nefarious way, but I think it was just Alda as Hawkeye was such a creative force and so compelling
he was a
performer.
magnetic personality.
That you just could not help making more of the shows be about him, even though Trapper John was ostensibly the main character in the movie. Wayne Rogers just couldn't help but sort of get overwhelmed a little, and so when he was replaced in the middle of the third season when Hawkeye returns in the first episode of season 4, which is called Welcome to Korea, after he goes on a long bender in Tokyo. He comes back and finds out that Trapper has been discharged, and he never got a chance to say goodbye. They couldn't contact Hawkeye, and so Trapper just leaves. And that is a thread that they continue through the rest of the seasons, that Hawkeye never fully got over that. That his friend just left him. In fact, in the final episode, the very last episode,
I was about to say,
there's a reference to Hawkeye talking about the Trapper. He says Trapper left without saying goodbye too, and he says, "Is it the war that stinks or me?" And I love that they kept that going. That ate away at Hawkeye. That his best friend left him. So when they bring in Mike Farrell as BJ Honeycutt, BJ in a lot of ways is a duller character because he's married, he's loyal to his wife, except for one episode. But he's much more of a normal guy, but I liked the greater contrast between the two. He's less of a hellraiser. He's less of he doesn't have the need to be as in-your-face disobedient as Hawkeye. And in fact, the first episode in with Colonel Potter, where he's bringing all of his officers into his office to talk, to introduce them all. He's reading off the names, and he says, Captain B.J. Honeycutt, and B.J. goes, "Yes, sir," and then he goes through, okay, you're this, you're that, and then he goes, Captain Benjamin Franklin Pierce, and Hawkeye goes, "Yo," and Potter goes, "Keep your yos to yourself," and so it's like, Hawkeye can't help himself. He has to be sort of disobedient. He has to establish, I'm not Army. BJ doesn't feel the need to do that. BJ is more kind of a get-along guy, even though he is just as anti-war, he's just as anti-military, he's just as much of a rabble-rouser as Hawkeye. He's just quieter about it. And I like that about him. I like that he's more subtle in his insolence. So I sort of like that.
Yeah, and the banter between them is very, you notice that with Mike Farrell's delivery, where it's always, his zingers are very sort of understated.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely the show morphed from being sort of a two-hander with Trapper and Hawkeye into I was going to say straight man situation, but I don't even know that that's necessarily what I would call it with BJ. It was just different, it was just different, but different is fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Trapper was such a great character. I mean, I mentioned this to you online. I mean, there's the episode in the third season where they think Trapper is going to be discharged.
Yes, checkup.
And that ends up being sort of the Trapper farewell episode in hindsight. And man, I thought it was terrific. And watching that, knowing that, well, we're like a few episodes from him leaving anyway, the emotion that Hawkeye expresses, Like, thanks, you made this place bearable, or something to that effect. I'm probably screwing it up. It was terrific, you know. I mean, there's an added poignancy, and especially now that unfortunately Wayne Rogers has passed on too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Just as Wayne Rogers was sort of heading out the door, they actually kind of gave him more to do. There's an episode in season 3 called "Love and Marriage," where we find out that a guy.
Oh
yeah. We find out that there's a soldier who's marrying a Korean woman, and it's clear that she's a prostitute, and it's clear that this is a scam. And originally, the guy, Dennis Dugan, who's a director now, he directs Adam Sandler movies.
No kidding. Oh, how funny. That's him.
Yeah, that's Dennis Dugan.
Really
Yeah. He, what his name? He played, what's his name? Charlie Brockovich or something on the Rockford Files. I forget. Eddie whatever the hell his character's name was. But Dennis Dugan. But he ends up, he sells himself as they call him, clean cut boy McShane. And
right.
he's this kind of aw shucks, I didn't know, or whatever. And there's this wonderful moment where Trapper, Hawkeye has to go off out of the camp. So Trapper invites Clean Cut Boy McShane into his tent, and McShane drops the illusion, and he reveals himself to be a slime ball. And he's like, what's the problem? You know, what's wrong with an enlisted man getting in on the gravy? And
right.
Trapper has this great bit where he says, you call me sir one more time, I'm going to prescribe a 24-hour enema. And it's like Wayne Rogers is terrific in the scene, and it's one of his last episodes on the show. And I remember thinking when I watched that one, geez, if they had given Wayne Rogers more stuff like this, he wouldn't have left. They're giving it to him now, as by the time he's already decided to leave the show. Well,
and the thing of it is that, I mean, because there's a lot of he said, she said about why he ended up leaving, but I mean, if he'd been willing to stick it out, the wheel would have come back around, because in 11 seasons there would have been plenty of Trapper-centric episodes.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, I have to, I wonder if by the time Mike Farrell came aboard that they didn't realize that we need to balance this a little better, because Mike Farrell as B.J. Hunter became a co-equal. I mean, Hawkeye was always the first among equals. There's no doubt about it. But B.J. got a lot to do, and he, in fact, he's my favorite character. He's my favorite character on the show. I'd say because I like his quiet rebellion, and I love the fact that he got a lot of great jokes. They didn't just give Hawkeye all the jokes. There's a wonderful episode in season 5 called Dear Sigmund, where Sidney Friedman, oh God, I love Sidney Friedman, is writing a letter to Sigmund Freud as kind of a therapeutic thing. And there's this great bit where he explains why he's hanging out at the camp so long, because he's depressed, basically.
Yeah. And that was an Alan Alda written episode, I believe.
Right, yes it is. And it's a wonderful episode. And he goes on this long, very sensitive spiel about a patient that was depressed and ends up killing himself, and Sidney missed the signals, and he's feeling very guilty about that. And right as he talks about that he's not doing his work anymore, Frank Burns emerges from his cot underneath all these clothes, and he starts making fun of Sidney Friedman. And there's this great exchange where Hawkeye says, "Oh God, I thought that lump on his bed was dirty laundry," and BJ goes, "It is." So I love it. Now I love, to me, if that joke had been in an earlier season, the jokes would have been flipped. They would have given Hawkeye the stinger, but instead they give it to BJ. And I thought, well, they were able to, whether that was Mike Farrell being more assertive, or the writers were realizing we need to give BJ more to do. But I like the show became more balanced under BJ.
Well, and just, I mean, if this is turning into like the BJ Honeycutt love fest, but I mean, I'm a big fan of the character too, and I just, like I said, I just watched The Bus, and there's this little moment that jumped out at me where they've got the prisoner played by Sun Taek Oh, and Frank is guarding him, and he's being sort of the quintessential ugly American, and then BJ takes over the shift to watch him, and Frank storms off, and you see BJ looking at the prisoner, and he just kind of does like the talkie motion with his hands, like, oh yeah, he likes to talk a lot, and he kind of rolls his eyes a little, and I was like, I love that, it's this understated thing, but it gives you a sense of who the character is.
Yeah, I do want to wind back a little in the earlier seasons as the show got more popular. And CBS sort of left it alone. There is a wonderful episode from the first season called "Sometimes You Hear the Bullet," which is really a lot of people consider the beginning of Matt, like the real start. of the show, because
Yes.
it's the one where it mixes, heartbreaking, pathos with laughs, and where an old friend of BJ's, of course, an old friend of Hawkeye's shows up at the camp and then is shot to death in war, and then Hawkeye's the one that has to work him on the table, and he cries about it. There's a great moment where the network was completely against that episode. They thought, this is too serious. This is a comedy. People don't want to see this. And there's a legendary story where apparently some network flack cornered Larry Gelbart upon seeing Sometimes You Hear the Bullet and said, "You know what, Gelbart? Someday I'm gonna tell you how you guys ruined MASH."
Wow.
And, and I'm sure that guy was probably ended up getting promoted at some point
Right.
in network television.
He failed upward.
Yeah, he failed upward. He's absolutely, but it's
which is like something out of MASH, by the way.
which of course happens to Frank Burns. But we could talk about that shortly. But later on, as the show got more confident, they were able to tackle heavier issues. There's an episode in season...
And that episode, by the way, we should mention Ron Howard was
right
in that episode.
Ron Howard as a kid that lies to get into fighting because he's only like 15
for the glory.
For the glory, and to impress his girlfriend Bernice. That stupid
Right.
Bernice wants medals. He wants to see medals on his chest. But there's an episode in season 2 called George, where we find out that there is a soldier who was beaten up by his fellow unit mates because he's gay.
Right,
and Burns, of course, wants to rat him out, wants to throw him out of the army. Thank God we've gotten over that mentality. And Burns is repulsed by who he calls what he calls a cupcake. And
right.
It's Hawkeye and Trapper are like, well, this cupcake, wants to go back and serve his time. And and Hawkeye and Trapper sort of arrange it to blackmail Frank because they get him to admit that he cheated on his medical exam.
Right.
But they have this attitude of basically, what business of it is yours? He's a soldier.
Yeah.
He's a lawyer. And you think about, this is 1973. They're doing this. Talk about being ahead of the curve.
I mean, that's pretty revolutionary for prime time.
Yeah, I mean that's an astounding episode. You watch it now, and there's some parts of it that are a little ham-handed. I mean, he talks about, they were like, how do the other guys even know you were gay? And he says, well, it was something that happened once years ago. And you're like, well, something that happened once years ago doesn't make you gay, but you forgive it because the show's heart is in the right place. And later on in the third season, there was an episode called OR, which takes place entirely in the operating room. There's no laugh track.
That's a really good one.
Yeah, it is all about the blood and guts of working on these guys. And there's a moment in that episode where Henry has a patient wheeled in front of him, and he looks, and we don't see it. What's wrong with this kid? And he calls over Hawkeye, and he says, I'm not ready to make decisions like this. He says, but this kid is going to require 18 hours worth of work, and then who knows how many pints of blood, and worst off, he'll never make it. And Hawkeye says, meanwhile, we could save some of the others. What are we going to do? And Henry basically allows the kid to die on the table. Yeah. And you're like, holy, this is Henry Blake, a guy who has, he talks about himself and says, the biggest decision he had to make back home was whether to get the cat fixed. And here he is having to make decisions like that. And it's a remarkable episode. And it's amazing that this aired on network television in 1973.
And just to piggyback off what you're saying, Henry Blake as a character, if we're talking about the opportunities that could have been afforded Trapper, in the years to come, I mean, Henry, the nuance that we started to see in him, especially in the third season, we can only imagine that would have further, enriched him in the years ahead. So I have to imagine that McLean Stevenson looked back with a lot of regret for leaving that show.
Yeah.
Because nothing he did in the years since could have measured up to playing this character on MASH.
Yeah, it's a shame when you see an actor who basically became kind of like a punchline after that, because McLean Stevenson was, the '70s version of Shelley Long.
Yeah, or David Caruso.
Or David,
right,
the '90s version of that is David Caruso, is someone who leaves a hit show early and then basically never does much of anything of note, and you just look back and you say, "What the hell was wrong with you? You were on an all-star team. What are you doing?"
Yeah.
And the fact that McLean Stevenson was never in anything very good after this, it obscures the fact that he is tremendous in this show as Henry Blake.
There's so many
fantastic.
moments, the episode, I don't remember off the top of my head what it is, but where he's watching the home video footage, and they're all watching it in the office.
Yes.
Of his wife and stuff, and the sadness that you see on his face, and you see why he's so he presents as sort of like a happy drunk, because there's just this inherent sadness of him, this normal suburban dad who's stuck here, and he's in charge of these life or death decisions in a much deeper way than Hawkeye and these people are,
Yeah, we see this footage, and of course it's silent because
right.
They don't have any, which makes it to me even more powerful that you're just watching these sort of home movies, and you see his wife, and it's in black and white, and his kids, and they have like these cards, and they flip the cards over, and it says "Miss you."
Right.
And they cut to Henry, and he's tearing up, and it's a very powerful moment, and it's a shame when you look at someone like that who really didn't do much else. And it just becomes shorthand for that guy's a joke, and you're like, but when you give him the good material, he can do it, and they gave him great material, and when you're talking about Henry Blake, we have to talk about how they got rid of him, which was up until the final episode was the most famous episode of MASH of all time.
Right.
They decided at some point along the line that we are going to kill Henry Blake off. And this was a decision that, I don't know if you could do nowadays. I honestly wonder if a TV network would not interfere to the level where they would just say, you can't do it. But MASH was a huge hit, and they had the creative sort of heft to say, we're going to do it. And, we watch Henry earn his points, which of course they didn't do in the Korean War, and they never did for doctors anyway, but that's a side thing. But Henry gets rotated home, and he says bye to everybody, and the show is over. The episode's over. Everything's great, and it's sad because Radar's surrogate father is now gone, and we all know that Frank Burns is going to be in charge, that's a nightmarish, that's a real Obama Trump switch right there, and the episode's over. Everything's
right.
Okay, and then we have this scene in the operating room where Radar walks in and reads this telegram or this sort of message that comes in, and he reads it. I love Gary Berghoff's take on this. He reads it completely emotionlessly.
Yeah.
I loved that choice where he just says, I have a message. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake's plane shot down over the Sea of Japan. It spun in. There were no survivors. And then they just pan across all the actors, all of whom are covered in face masks because they're performing surgery. So all we get are their eyes. And yet we see everything we need to see in that moment. We see Burns. Even Burns looks upset.
Yeah.
Margaret.
He's shell-shocked. Margaret looks like she's about to cry.
Openly crying. Father Mulcahy is just sort of flummoxed. Klinger is assisting Hawkeye and Trapper, and we hear someone off-screen drop an instrument. And it bangs on the wood floor, and it is really, I don't know whether that was intentional or not, but it's
No,
genius.
it wasn't. According to Larry Gelbart, and that's the second take. What Larry Gelbart said is that they did the first one, and Gary Berghoff just nailed it, and when they had to do another take because the camera didn't move the right way or whatever, and they were like, man, how can he top his first take? And somehow he managed to do that, and he said that it wasn't intentional to have that implement drop, but it just felt so perfect given the scenario that we remember that as part of the aesthetic of that particular scene.
Yeah, it reverberates. You hear like and it's just, and then the final shot we have is of Hawkeye and Trapper, and they just stare straight ahead of like, I just can't believe it. They just,
It's the look on Hawkeye's face. It really like I don't. It's hard to encapsulate. There's the. It's not shock. It's almost like anger on Hawkeye's face. Like F this war.
hmm
Because that was because I in prep for this episode I was watching that scene in particular, and
Oof.
that was really I was looking at Alan Alda's just his eyes. I mean, it's like uh, this anger born of sadness, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah. You just because I can't believe that this could
Yeah,
happen to this good man. This is a
yeah,
father. He's a husband. He's a healer, and yet and he was home. He was home. He made it,
yeah,
and yet like it's not to sound flip, but it's like running a marathon and tripping
right,
in the last 3 feet before you get to the finish line. So
right,
yeah, it's a stunning moment, and audiences were just completely flummoxed that they would do this, that a sitcom would kill off a character like this so unceremoniously, and it really established that MASH is not going to it's not going to be, as Larry Gilbert put, a smile button where it's
yeah.
just going to just oh wait, it's Abbott and Costello goes to war. No, this is some serious shit that goes on
I
here.
I read an interview, a contemporaneous one with Clayne Stevenson, where he talked about how he couldn't even go to the rap party afterwards. He just
Mm.
sat in his dressing room after rapping, and he just cried for 2 hours.
Oof. Yeah.
Uh, because I think obviously the weight of saying goodbye to the character and the show, but also I think the family that had built up between these actors too. Um, I have to imagine that he felt the pangs of regret almost instantly. I mean, how could you not?
Yeah. Yeah. You're just like, oh, geez, what did I do? Like,
Yeah,
what did I
you
do?
know,
But
yeah,
luckily, again, it's one of those things where it's like a happy accident, because that gave the show the opportunity to bring in a new commanding officer, and in the very next season, it brought in Harry Morgan, the great Harry Morgan,
yeah. Who was
the
already well known at that
the
time? Yeah,
legendary Harry Morgan, Dragnet, a million movies as Colonel Sherman Potter, and you know, I'm sure, Zachy, that you've seen this over time. That people of a certain political stripe like to dismiss MASH. It's just liberal claptrap. It's
yeah.
it's anti-war. It hates the military. It says everybody in the military are idiots. It's just liberal garbage. Well,
And Colonel Potter's a response to that.
exactly. That is like
Yeah,
every time I've heard somebody say that, I'm like, have you seen the show?
yeah,
Because this show created Colonel Potter. It did not inherit Colonel Potter. It created Colonel Potter, and Colonel Sherman T. Potter, could not be a better example of a reason to be a military man.
yeah. I mean, he's a riposte specifically to Hawkeye's critique
Yes.
of the military. I mean, because Hawkeye, oh God, regular army.
Yep.
We know what we're going to get from this guy, and Colonel Potter. What's interesting about him is that it's not like there's a learning curve process where he sort of becomes acclimated to Hawkeye's way. It's like he lays out the rules right up top. He's like, look, we're going to do things this way, but boy, episode 1,
Yeah.
change of command. He's part of the group.
Yep.
You know.
There's a beautiful scene. We don't have time to talk about all this, and we'll get into maybe I do a whole MASH podcast at some point down the line. But there's a wonderful. We don't get the filmmaking. You don't really talk about a TV show's filmmaking that much because it's really a writer's medium, not a director's medium.
Especially in that era.
Yeah, but there's when Hawkeye and Trapper and Potter get drunk for the first time together.
And BJ and Potter.
I'm sorry, yes, BJ and Potter, and they all get drunk together, and that's when they bond, and then they realize that they can get along. And after all these scenes where they're joking back and forth about, they're saying, to Bess Truman, to Margaret Truman, to Eris Truman, they're doing all this stuff.
Right.
They have this
Right.
beautiful shot outside the tent at night. We half see the three of them through the gauze, through the netting,
Right.
and it's quiet, and they're singing. There's a long, long night of waiting till my dreams all come true, and the camp is quiet, and you just hear these three guys singing, and it's a beautiful moment. It's like, and the camera slowly pans back as it starts, and it's really like, I know the show doesn't want you to ever think that you should want to be in Korea. You don't want to
Right.
be there. But you watch something like that and you're like, I'd love to have friends like that. I'd love to have friends that are forged, that the friendships are forged in fire like that. Because that's such a sweet moment. Like, I want to be in that tent with those guys.
Yeah. Yeah, it's if you have to be in this hellish situation, these are the people you want to be in it with.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, there's a line just like that in the last episode. We'll get to that. And for my money, I suggest that the combination of Hawkeye and Hot Lips. We haven't mentioned Hot Lips enough, and we should, because she was a
We haven't
wonderful
at all.
character.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the combo of in seasons 4 and 5, which is Hawkeye, Trap. I keep saying Trapper. Hawkeye, BJ, Colonel Potter, Margaret, Frank Burns, Radar, Father McKay, and Klinger, to me, are the best. Not only are seasons 4 and 5 to me the best seasons of MASH, they are the best seasons of television, period.
Yeah, I've seen you say that before. Yeah.
Because they experimented. They did episodes that I think are incredibly gutsy in terms of their form, their filmmaking, and they figured the audience was willing to go with them because they had established trust. They knew,
right.
And there's an episode in season 4 called The Interview, which is basically reality television.
Right.
I mean, how many shows now have people talking to the camera? And here is an episode entirely in black and white with a reporter, Clete Roberts, interviewing the members of the 477, and all the actors were given the questions beforehand and then allowed to write their own answers. That's extraordinary, that you could give the actors that kind of leeway, and the writers knew the actors were going to be able to do it. They were going to be able to stay in character and yet say something interesting that you could make an episode out of it. It's unbelievable.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't they made the pilot Walter about Radar O'Reilly? Doesn't that sort of call back to that episode, The Interview?
There's a little bit of a callback, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's an extraordinary episode, and there's a line in it that Hawkeye has where the reporter asks Hawkeye, what have you brought with you? Did you bring anything with you? Creature comforts. Mm-hmm. And Hawkeye says, I brought the dictionary. And why? Why'd you bring the dictionary? He says, well, I figure it has all the other books in it. The first time I heard that, I was like, what? He was like, imagine like my 10-year-old head, And when I was running my MASH blog, aftermash.blogspot.com, I wrote about that. When I got to that episode, I wrote that I assumed that line was in the culture already, because it was so brilliant. I couldn't believe that Alan Alda wrote it. I just couldn't believe that it just wasn't something that existed for hundreds of years, and Alan Alda just sort of pulled it. And I will always be proud of this. Larry Gelbart left a comment on my MASH blog, which is unbelievable. Who would have guessed? Larry Gelbart was trolling MASH sites, but he
amazing.
He left a comment. He said, "Nope, that's Alda's line. He came up with it." I thought, unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. And so I think that combo of having Potter mixed with Frank Burns, to me, is just so. It's hysterically funny. I mean, it's just they had some of the best lines. The Dear Sigmund episode where Sidney Friedman, another great creation of the show. I look at those 2 seasons and I say, MASH, no TV show ever did anything better than this. They were just so on fire, and the cast was so perfect. And it had to end, of course, because Larry Linville got tired of playing this cartoon of a character, which is understandable. In season 5, they married Margaret Houlihan off to Donald Penobscot, this military man, and at that point, Larry Linville just thought, "I have nothing left to do here," and he signed.
And he wasn't wrong. I mean, of the three departures, I think I look at Frank and I'm like, yeah, they pretty much played out that thread as far as it could go.
Yeah, I agree. Although
I think he left it on the field,
although there is a moment, actually, again, much like the one I talked about with Trapper, where in season 5 there's an episode called Margaret's Engagement, where Margaret comes back from Tokyo and she reveals to Frank she's getting married to Donald Penobscot, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Penobscot. She could never marry anyone who didn't outrank her. And Frank loses it. Frank just loses it, and he goes and he wanders out into the brush, and he arrests a Korean family and their cow, and he is overtired because he's been up all night and running around, and to calm him down, Radar calls Frank's mom to talk to him on the phone. He says sometimes a guy's just got to talk to his mom. And Frank starts talking to his mother about what's going on at MASH, and he has this amazing line where he says, I had this friend who I thought liked me, but just pretended to like me, like the way Dad used to.
Wow. Wow.
Like, whoa. And it's one of those things where I'm like, if they had kind of mined that a little, they really could have turned Frank into something a little deeper, but they obviously just weren't necessarily interested in doing it. But that line has always haunted me, that that's terrific, yeah. Frank Burns had enough self-awareness to know, well, now we know, like, we kind of know why he is the way he is. His father never loved him. That's pretty. Yeah, I mean,
I think that's terrific. Actually, I don't remember that exchange, but that's fantastic. I mean, I think the problem to some extent with the character is he had been so buffoonized.
Yeah.
In that his doctoring was known to be subpar in the narrative of the show. Right, so there was just no way to reclaim the character, because it's one thing if you say, well, he's like a horrible human being, but there's this, he's at least good at his doctoring. That allows you to reclaim the character in some way. And to be honest, I think that when they brought on Winchester, that it was with an eye towards that.
Right. In the 6th season, when they bring in David Ogden Stiers as Major Winchester, yes, he's a great doctor, and in fact, in some ways, he's even a better technical surgeon than Hawkeye and BJ. In fact, that first episode with Winchester ends with he's a thoracic surgeon. That's his big expertise, and Hawkeye's going to handle it. And Colonel Potter says, no, better give it to Winchester. He's our man at thoracics. And Hawkeye's like, what's so great about him? And he says something like, I'm not going to play second scalpel to this garbanzo for the rest of the war. And Winchester just is not as fun because he's not as hateful.
Right.
But you couldn't just keep doing Frank Burns. You had to evolve the show a little. And so I think David Ogden Stiers maybe gets a bum rap because he's associated with kind of this quote unquote less funny years of the show.
Right. But the wind down.
Yeah. But it's a natural evolution. You just, the show had to morph a little. And they gave him a lot to do. They had hidden depths to him, which I liked a lot, because he's another character, much like Colonel Potter, who doesn't bend. I mean, he loosens up, but he always sort of retains his sort of standoffish, and, in the show, he's a conservative Republican, but he's not the hypocrite that Burns is. Burns talks about we should give this country back to the Indians. It's like, good Lord, he doesn't even know what country he's in.
Right.
And I love that there's a later episode where Hawkeye's ultimate insult to Winchester is, your father voted for Roosevelt 4 times. Like that's his way of getting under Winchester's skin. But I love David Ogden. I thought he was a great character. I love the whole bit about his sister Honoria, that he has this beloved sister at home. Like, to me, the show never quite recovers from the loss of Frank Burns, but it also never recovered from the loss of Larry Gelbart, because Larry Gelbart left after the 5th season as well. And Larry Gelbart is one of the great genius writers of all time, and there was just no way to replace him.
That's true.
And then the last sort of major cast change is, again, we talked about, is Radar. Radar shipped out after the 8th season, and that was, again, another instance of, Gary Berghoff was getting older. His hairline was receding at a rapid pace, and he couldn't keep playing a 19-year-old, this sort of Gosh G. Willikers character. But, I've seen interviews where he's talked about that he represents a character that you don't see much on television, which is kind of an innocence, sweetness. I mean, and I will admit, I try to stay focused on these shows. I have so much to say about this damn show. But, people like to say that entertainment doesn't affect your behavior. I think people that want to excuse what they put out, whether it's a violent movie, that doesn't change your behavior. I don't know if that's true. I think it does affect your behavior in some ways, because Radar was the first vegetarian I ever saw on television.
Oh, really?
And I'm a vegetarian. I've been one for 20 years, and
Wow.
he was an influence on me because he rescues a lamb when there's a lamb brought into the camp.
Right, right.
He can't abide the notion that they're going to kill this little thing, and so Radar, that was a big deal to me. That was like, wow, you could, that was the thing. And another instance of like a behavior that I learned was Hawkeye hates guns.
Right.
Hawkeye hates guns, and I hate guns. I hate guns. And every time, I learned it kind of from Hawkeye Pierce. It was the kind of, just this utter revulsion towards firearms. And he has the great episode where he talks about, I'll bind their wounds, I'll heal their wounds, but I will not inflict their wounds. And that's a big moment, and that was a big moment for me. I always had that kind of like, I don't want to have anything to do with them. It's a show that helped to kind of form who I was. And if it sounds like we're wrapping up a little bit, I think we are because we have limited time and we can just go on and on and on about this. But like,
I'm loving the conversation. That's for sure. We should make this a part one of a continuing discussion.
Well, I have something to mention about that. We'll get to the end of the show, but we'll jump ahead a little to near the end. Like, what did you think about the last final seasons? Because a lot of people say the show outwore its welcome. You say it didn't become Zombie MASH, and I agree with that. But what do you think about like kind of the later years where it was just kind of the cast changes had stopped and it was really just kind of these core guys going kind of finding variations on a theme at that point?
Well, so again, I think it's helpful to contextualize my response with the way I watched it, which was pretty much the DVD equivalent of binge watching. I would imagine that for people who were watching it contemporaneously, it may have indeed felt like, okay, let's cut to the chase here. But I think it helps knowing, well, the finish line is this many seasons out or whatnot, and so let's just enjoy the time we have with these characters. It was a different show. I mean, by the time it ended, and you either dig that or you don't. And I know plenty of people who said, by the end it was the adventures of Hawkeye Pierce, Bleeding Heart Liberal.
Right.
And I respect that. I don't fully subscribe to that, but I can respect that. But I think that whatever contours we went through as the show ended, I mean, I think the finale was so well done, especially the closing moments. I do feel like it was maybe a little bit longer than it needed to be, but hey, it's a perfect summation of the show, and I think the end of the show sums up the journey that audiences had been on. So when you look at the cultural and political and social changes that happened between 1972 and 1983, and the fact that MASH was there through all of that, I mean, the end of the show was really the end of an era.
Yep.
And I think it's fascinating that you can look at, if we're looking at TV comedy, you have the end of MASH almost kind of overlaps with the beginning of Cheers, and if you look at the MASH and Cheers together form this 2-decade run of really groundbreaking TV comedy, like how you can do comedy on TV.
Yeah, they were on for 1 year. They were on at the same time, that's the golden age of television right there.
Yeah,
and even featuring some of the same writers.
And really, if you want to tack on at the end, add on the 11 years of Frasier, we've got a solid 3 decades of really amazing television.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary show. One other thing I will mention before we get to the last episode is one of the things that they did in the last couple seasons was sort of, again, spin the dial a little in terms of not so much content, but form, which is something The Simpsons is doing.
Yes.
I haven't been watching The Simpsons. I haven't watched The Simpsons in, 15 years. But it seems like they don't have anything new content-wise to do, so it's more about, let's do an episode with blocks. Let's do an episode with this. And that's fine. I'm not running the show down. But that just sort of happens. And MASH did that. MASH did an episode called Dreams, where we see everybody's dreams. So it becomes a very abstract show.
Yes.
We get to see them do something that you didn't get to do. They did an episode called Lifetime, which takes place in real time. It takes place in a patient has 24 minutes before with his heart valve being closed before he's going to be permanently paralyzed, and we see a clock on the screen, and so the show unfolds in real time. So Alan Alda realized that you could play with the show, like you could play with the format. And in terms of with the format, as you mentioned, the final episode runs 2.5 hours with commercials. I do think it's probably a little long. I admit. My biggest fault I have with the final episode is that it doesn't feel like a MASH episode. It feels like a movie.
Right.
And that's my only nitpick, is that it just doesn't feel like the same show you've been watching for 11 years. But what can you do? You know what I mean? Like,
right.
This story is so huge. And unlike a lot of other final episodes, you mentioned Cheers, you mentioned Frasier, where there is not a natural... Cheers and Frasier don't have a natural end date.
Right.
You have to kind of contrive some big moment to put a period on the sentence. Well, MASH had that at the end of the war. That's what everybody's waiting to see. And I love that they chose to give that moment where we see the look on someone's face when the war is announced to be over. They give that to Winchester, which I love. I love they don't give it to Hawkeye. You know? And Alan Alda co-wrote the episode.
That's on Alan Alda. I was about to say. I mean, to his credit, he didn't give himself that moment.
Right. I love that. I love that when Winchester is saying goodbye to the Korean musicians that he has befriended, and as he's walking, we hear the voiceover guy saying the hostilities in Panmunjom. The truce has been signed. Hostilities will end 12 hours from now. The war is over. And Winchester looks like he's going to cry. He's so happy. And Steers nails it. He just nails that moment of being so happy that this thing that we're finally been waiting for so long has now happened. And I love the last episode. I think it's beautiful to get to see everyone say goodbye to one another. The final moments where they all literally leave one at a time. We've really been derelict in not mentioning Margaret Houlihan at all in the show. It just
really.
Loretta Swit is wonderful. I got to meet Loretta Swit. It is the number one fan experience of my life. You've met so many hundreds of famous people. I've only met a handful, but the number one is Loretta Swit. When I got to meet her at a con and tell her how much I love MASH, which is one of the great moments of my life.
That's amazing.
But those final scenes where everyone gets a storyline, Klinger's marrying Soon Lee, and Winchester's looking for a gig, and Margaret doesn't know what to do because she's an army brat. What do you do if you're an army brat and you don't have a war to fight? They all get a storyline, and I get emotional even thinking about it. And the moment that I think about the most, and you mentioned something about this earlier on, is when it's the final moment on the helipad with Hawkeye and BJ. And BJ says, I don't know, I'm blowing the line, but he says, I can't imagine what this place would have been like if I hadn't found you here.
Right.
And it's that idea that you mentioned about, like, if you have to do this, these are the people you want to do it with. And it was a big moment to me to see two men hug and be emotional with one another and being able to say to one another, not literally, but say it, I love you. You're my best friend. That was so important to me as in my development. And that's like, I watched the show live when it aired. I was in sixth grade. It was a huge thing, and it stays with me. It's just one of those things where it's just such a beautiful. And I really thought, for a show that had so much, they stuck the landing. They really did.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I mean, and the thing with Colonel Potter, where they say goodbye to Colonel Potter, what do they do? How do they say goodbye to? What's their gift to Colonel Potter? They give him a salute.
Right.
They give him a no nonsense, no bullshit salute. And it's
if you know the characters, you know what a big deal that is for Hawkeye to do that.
Exactly.
I think Henry's the only person he saluted before then, right? Wasn't it?
Something like that. I think he saluted like 3 people in the course of 11 years. But when they give it to Colonel Potter, they mean it. They are saluting this man. And it's beautiful. And the final shot of the final show is Hawkeye in the chopper as he's taking off. BJ has left a note for him saying goodbye, written in stones. We see Hawkeye look at the note. He smiles. We get one last look at the camp, which is now deserted.
Right.
which is it's weird when you're looking at a set that you're so familiar with, and then you see it as a skeleton.
Yeah.
You know, it's bizarre. And we see Hawkeye look. He rears his head back. The chopper takes off and it fades to black, and that's it. And that's the end of the show. And Alan Alda, to his credit, said, "That's it. We'll never see Hawkeye again," and we never did.
Yeah, and I mean, I think when I look at finales, this might seem like not the strongest of tendrils connecting, but what feels in my mind a very similar finale is for Deep Space Nine. Because that too is the aftermath of a war and the breakup of our cast. And I think that there's two kinds of finales. Kind of you mentioned there's the finale that, well, life goes on and tomorrow's going to be another adventure with these characters that we'll never see. And then there's the finale that says life as we've known it with these characters is over forever. Right. And to me that's what the MASH finale is. It's this period that brought these people together, that made them a family, is over, and they'll never be together the same way ever again.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason that the stone goodbye at the end remains, even now, such a poignant image, because it's a marker, a grave marker, if you will, of this era for these characters and our time with them.
No, that makes a lot of sense. No, it really does. I mean, I love the Cheers finale, but you also know Norm's going to be back at the bar the next day, as opposed to this.
Yeah.
Where, this unit, the 477, no longer exists. We have seen the sum total of these guys' experiences together, and that's a very powerful. It's kind of it's like when you lose someone in your life. Whether they move away or a relationship breaks up, it's a marker, as you said, it's a literal marker of this part of these people's lives is over. And as much as part of me was always so tempted to, like, could they have just done a reunion movie? I just wanted to see it so bad. I'm glad they never did. I'm glad they never.
Well, but they did have a reunion of sorts. Do we want to talk about this?
Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I mean, After MASH is a fascinating thing, because I think my sense is you're more forgiving of it than I am.
That's probably true.
I look at the show, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad show. It just feels like a completely extraneous, unnecessary show.
I would agree with that. My thing with After MASH is its reputation is much worse than it deserves. Is After MASH a good show? No, it isn't. Even one of the writers, Ken Levine, over on his blog, Ken Levine Blogspot, even he never misses an opportunity to crap on his own work on that show. So it is not a good show. I will say that. But by the fact that it is unavailable, it is completely unavailable. It is not on DVD. It's not streaming. It's not anywhere. It's not even on the Martinis and Medicine box set. I mean, they have the movie in the box set, which has less to do with the show than After MASH. But the fact that show was so completely just, like Russian propaganda, that never happened. No, we never did that show. It gives people the illusion that, boy, that thing must be a disaster. And
well, it was sort of the Joey of its time, the Friends spinoff.
Right.
And kind of similar, too, because Joey lasted 2 seasons. First season actually did pretty well, and then it just crashed and burned second season. After MASH, same thing.
Yeah. I think a show set in a veterans hospital dealing with how we treat our soldiers after a war, I think that is ripe material for a show.
Sure.
But they just, look, your main characters were Hawkeye and BJ and Margaret, and you get rid of them and you replace them with. Sometimes you get lucky and you get a Frasier. You find someone as compelling a performer as Kelsey Grammer, and he can fill the space. But
and the thing what's so interesting about that is could they have known when they introduced Frasier on Cheers that he would go on to single-handedly carry the legacy of that show? Because nobody could have known. You know what I mean?
No, they got completely lucky.
And I think, just to piggyback on what you're saying, I like Colonel Potter, I like Klinger, I like Father Mulcahy. Do I like them as the leads of the show?
No.
Not really.
No. No.
You know?
And in fact, in the second season, they brought in a character played by a guy named David Aykroyd, no relation to the more famous Aykroyd,
Right.
who was kind of like a Hawkeye character. They brought in this
Right.
kind of hard-charging, irreverent doctor, and he's clearly Hawkeye. They're clearly trying to, get it. So I think if that show had been given more time to develop, I think it might have could have possibly gone somewhere, but it never really got that chance. The network futzed with it. As is typical with network television, is they assume that a spin-off should be out of the gate as successful as the show it is spinning off from, and that's not fair because it's a different show. It's not MASH. It's you can't possibly follow MASH, but they were like, well, why isn't this MASH? You're like, well, because it's not the same thing, and they put it on up against the A-Team. It's funny, you talked about the culture, about how MASH lasted so long that it sort of straddled several cultures. MASH started during the Vietnam War, and things were pretty, Nixon was president, and there was a lot of sort of rebellion going on. Well, when MASH went off the air, Ronald Reagan was president, and the country was heading into a much more conservative time. And people wanted to see shit blow up.
Right.
So Mr. T driving around in a van throwing grenades,
Right.
that's what people wanted to see. They didn't want to see Klinger and Soon Lee try to navigate racists who didn't like the fact that he had a Korean wife.
Yeah.
They don't want to see that. They want, we'll do it for the kids. That's what people wanted to see in 1983, not Aftermath. So, but I think if Aftermath was available, its reputation would rise a little. I really do. I think it's because it's been so buried that people just have never seen an episode just go, oh my God, that thing must be garbage.
You know what else is buried, though, Rob? And this is a show that was quite successful, was Trapper John M.D.
Right.
And this, I mean, 7 seasons it lasted. That's a hit by any measure. It's a success by any measure, and yet, down the memory hole. And this is a show that I really wish people would rediscover, because my memories of it, and I've sort of watched bits and pieces of it on YouTube, it's a pretty solid show of its era. I think Pernell Roberts is a pretty darn good Trapper John.
Yeah, I remember watching that show. I think I watched it because of the MASH connection, because I was like, oh, it's
Sure.
It's not Wayne Rogers, but it's Trapper John, and he would make the occasional references to Hawkeye Pierce or whatever, and I was like, ooh,
Right.
I was such a MASH nerd that I was like, it's part of the MASH cinematic universe, to use
Exactly.
current parlance.
That's right.
In terms of reunions, and this will be the thing we end with, there was a reunion in that in 1993 or 94, I forget exactly what. No, later this. I'm sorry, it was around 1989. The entire cast, save for Larry Linville and McLean Stevenson, who unfortunately had passed on, did get together, and they did a reunion show, and it's on the set. It's on the
That's
set,
right.
and it's with Gene Reynolds and Larry Gelbart and Burt Metcalf and Alan Arbus as Sidney Friedman, which is to me, that's the character who should have spun off, Sidney Friedman. I think he would have been a great, like you could have done a great like Lou Grant type show, where like an hour-long drama with Sidney Friedman. I love Alan Arbus as Sidney Friedman so much. But they did get all together. We got to see them reminisce. They didn't play the characters, but we did get to see them all together in a group setting, and that was fun. So to me, it's like we did kind of get a reunion. It was just a reunion that doesn't risk the legacy of the show, because it wasn't the characters, it was the actors.
Weren't there 2 reunion specials?
There was another one. There was an earlier one in '93, hosted by Shelley Long.
That's the one I was thinking, yeah. And then the 30th anniversary, so that would have been 02.
Yeah, that's right, 02.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the really good one, because you get to see them all together, and they're telling jokes and stuff like that, and they're all looking older, but they look great. I mean, everybody still looks fantastic.
And it's kind of the last time that the majority of the cast was together.
Right, because in the intermediate time, we've lost Wayne Rogers, and we've lost William Christopher, and we've lost Harry Morgan.
Harry Morgan also.
Yeah. So we did get a reunion. So the very last thing I will mention on this episode, because again we have just it's too big a topic to cover in an hour and change, is MASH is the last piece of fandom that I don't have a podcast on. Like, I have a podcast on Treasury Comics, I have a podcast on movies, I have a podcast on Aquaman, I have a podcast on Bob Dylan. I don't have a MASH podcast. I was hoping to start one, an episode-by-episode show for the 45th anniversary, which, as we said, is today. Because I cannot bend time and space, I just don't have time to do a show. but we wanted to do at least this. I will put this out there for people to pressure me. I am hoping to maybe start that show instead of for the 45th anniversary, which is today, to start it for the 35th anniversary of the final episode.
Oh, there you go.
Which would be February 28th, 2018. So maybe I will have time for that, because I would love to do an episode by episode deep dive of this show. And if I ever do it, Zachy, I hope that you would be willing to join me for at least a couple episodes.
I will gladly be the Sydney showing up periodically to offer my whatever wit and wisdom I might be perceived as having.
Fair enough. Well, that's a good.
I was gonna say Colonel Flag, but I like Sydney better.
Yeah,
so
no, you don't want to be Colonel Flag. Oh man, Colonel Flag, man. What part of the Trump cabinet would Colonel Flag be part of if he was around
Oh
today?
my goodness, yeah, really, right?
Anyway, we'll end this here. There's so much more to say, but at the very least, we got to talk a little bit about how much both Zachy and I love MASH for its 45th birthday. So, is there anything else you want to say about the show before we wrap up, Zachy?
If you're listening to this and somehow you've not seen it, you've got this solid piece of not just TV history, but really American history and pop culture history waiting for you, and you're in for a heck of a run. I mean, just start watching it and enjoy it, because there's a lot more to enjoy than to dislike in the run of MASH.
Absolutely true. And I will send this message out to 20th Century Fox Home End. Guys, streaming. What are you waiting for?
Yeah, again, put it back on Netflix or something. Yeah.
It was on when it was on Netflix, my girlfriend and I watched it on loop, and then they got rid of it. So I don't know what they're waiting for to make it. I would buy it all over again. I have the box set, but if they put all the seasons up on streaming, I would buy it in a heartbeat.
Here's my story. I actually had to buy it again, because the Martinis and Medicine set has the worst packaging in the history of humankind.
It very much does, yes.
So basically every second episode would just not play.
Yep.
So I dropped another $70 just so I could get a set that isn't a piece of garbage. So Fox got my money twice.
Yep. Come on, Fox. Again, go with the I mean, I go
the one thing I'll say though about streaming, this is what I think of. This is the stuff that, as a MASH fan, I think about. I'm used to watching the show without the laugh track.
Right.
So if it's on streaming, I'm like, I would need it without the laugh track.
It's interesting, whether they would offer it whether you could turn the laugh track on and off. I didn't even think about that, but you're right. Yeah, at least with the DVDs, you can choose which ones you want to do.
You can just switch it. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's MASH, everybody. As obviously, I could go on and on and on about it. We've already gone way past the limit of what Zachy and I talked about doing the show. But Zachy, where can people find you on the internet?
Well, you can find me at my website, Zachy'sCorner.com. That's ZAKIS Corner. You can also reach me on Twitter, just at Zachy's Corner. That's also my Instagram. I'm also at the Huffington Post, where my movie reviews go up regularly, as does the Movie Film Podcast, as does the Nostalgia Theater podcast. I'm in the middle on the Nostalgia Theater show of a series of classic Star Trek movie commentary tracks with my friend Glenn Greenberg, who is a former Marvel Comics editor and Star Trek fiction writer, and we're having some fun doing those. I imagine that if you listen to Rob's shows, you will enjoy those Star Trek commentaries as well. And I just want to thank you, Rob, for thinking of me to share a topic that I know is near and dear to you. I'm incredibly honored and flattered that I got to be part of this reminiscence for you.
Oh, thank you. And I love all the commentaries, the ones you do with Glenn and the ones you do with Brian. They are enormous fun. God bless you for doing Superman 4. Talk about taking one for the team.
We had a fun run with that.
Yeah. But, of course, you can find all the episodes of FW Presents and all our other shows on our network, which is fireandwaterpodcast.com. And if you're a big fan of MASH and you want to talk about episodes or favorite shows or favorite moments or whatever, we only scratched the surface of this show. Please leave comments over on our website. We'd really appreciate it. And I hope everybody enjoyed it. So I guess in the meantime, everybody, until the next episode of FW Presents, take care, everybody. And Zachy and I are going to go have some drinks at the Oak Club. So we will see you later. Bye.
Abyssinia.
all the good times. That's what I'll remember. I think there were 3.